I greatly appreciate the opportunity to present this material here this evening, and I thank you for coming. When I was invited to give a talk as part of this series on passion and emotion, I started to think about the relation between these two terms, passion and emotion. And if you think about the Western tradition for thinking about these psychological issues, you will observe that most often thinkers had an unswerving assumption to the effect that there's some kind of fundamental unity to the affective states. And they didn't care too much about which particular term they used as a label for this overarching category of affective states. So in some cases the word would be passion, but in other cases the word would be emotion. So many thinkers simply don't see a distinction worth drawing here. So if you look at Descartes, for example, Les Passions de l'âme, which is something he wrote late in his life, he's happy to use the word émotion or the word passion, and it's just a synonym. All right? And he's a good example. I think Spinoza would also be another example. So I started thinking, well, but aren't there thinkers who thought it was important to draw distinctions within this overarching category of affective events or states, right? And to use the words emotion and passion as labels for items in rather distinct categories. So I was looking for people who thought along those lines. Because in the recent literature, you will see very smart, well-informed thinkers who insist on that kind of distinction. And an example who's important to me is Antonio Damasio, whose books are brilliant. You know, he's a neuroscientist who knows whatever can be known today about the brain, right? The seat of these kinds of events, right? And Damasio argues that we really, once you know about the brain, you see the need to draw a distinction between what he calls primary and secondary emotions. So Damasio doesn't talk about emotions versus passions, but he could have done. Right? And other thinkers earlier than Damasio did precisely that. And one such person was one of the heroes of my story, the fellow on the right, Carl Georg Lange, a Danish physiologist, medical doctor, and researcher. Now, Lange was not a philosopher. He actually actively disliked a lot of philosophy. He called it metaphysics, and it was inconclusive, a lot of just verbiage, and blah, blah. Right? And he was a man of science, and he did a lot of fundamental work on such topics as pathologies of the spinal cord and how to cure chronic depression. And Lange actually pioneered the use of lithium, right, to treat chronically depressed people. And that, as you know, is something that does actually help, right? So he wasn't a philosopher. But he did something unusual, though. In 1885, he published a short book on, and here it gets tricky, because I have trouble knowing what to say here. I'm going to show you the Danish title of his book in a minute. It's called Om Sindsbevægelse, and I'll talk to you about how we need to translate the title of this book. But it's a short pamphlet on the psychology of affective states. And in that book, he insists on the distinction between emotion and passion. All right. The other character in my story is William James. You may know something about him. Indeed, brother to Henry James, right? And professor of psychology at Harvard University. Now, let me move on to my story. So first I'm going to present what is the standard account of the so-called James-Lange theory of emotion. If any of you are online right now, you can Google James-Lange theory of emotion, and you will find many authoritative sources telling you that there was an innovative psychological theory independently discovered by William James and Carl Lange, and that was a view that they converged on, and it was their account. That's the standard account. I'm going to challenge that account. I'm going to try to persuade you tonight that that account is seriously misleading. All right? And why is it seriously misleading? It's misleading in all kinds of ways. But the most important way in which it's misleading is that Carl Georg Lange found it very important, even crucial, to distinguish between different categories of affective states. And he used one term in Danish for the one, and he used the word passion for the other. James did not do that. And then I'm going to get around to some differences between them when it comes to issues in aesthetics, because Lange wrote a whole book in aesthetics late in his life, and in that book he says it's absolutely crucial to distinguish between emotions and passions, and most of what he's talking about in his book on aesthetics are what he would call passions. And then there's some parting remarks. So let me get on with it. How did this standard account get going? Well, it was James's fault. Now here's from his 1890, which is his Principles of Psychology, this huge sprawling book that he spent many, many years writing. He goes as follows. Now the general causes of the emotions are indubitably physiological. Professor C. Lange of Copenhagen, in the pamphlet in which I have already quoted, published in 1885 a physiological theory of their constitution and conditioning, which I had already broached the previous year in an article in Mind. Now, this is a curious combination of generosity and selfishness. Because what is James doing here? He's saying, oh, there was this really important independent discovery shared by Lange and me. But of course, I got there first 1 year earlier. So he's asserting that he was the true discoverer of this theory, but he's taking on board the support of this older, way more distinguished medical researcher and saying, you see, I have the backup of Lange, because Lange's book, little pamphlet from 1895, is filled with all sorts of evidence and so on. So this is the operation that, these are the influential declarations by William James. 5 years later, he says the following, and this is puzzling. In the year 1884, Professor Lange of Copenhagen and the present writer published, independently of each other, the same theory of emotional consciousness. They affirmed it to be the effect of the organic changes, muscular and visceral, of which the so-called expression of the emotion consists. And out here the year has changed now. It's in simultaneous independent discovery in the same year. Now, here's a reading list. This is the sort of corpus or background of this whole thing I'm presenting. So the first event to take note of, I don't know if you can read this in the back, I hope you can. James published this paper in Mind, 1884, What is an Emotion? Then Lange, under a year later, early in 85, publishes in Danish this small pamphlet, Om sindsbevægelser et psykofysiologiske studier. Now, how do we translate that title? If you come to the bottom here, you'll see that it was only in 1922 that we have the first English translation of this book by Lange, but it's actually not translated directly from the original Danish. This Istar A. Haupt made a translation of a faulty German translation of Lange's book. This was the 1887 Hans Kurella über Gemütsbewegungen, and there are serious translation problems in that document. And this guy, Haupt, didn't know Danish, and he just did a pretty faithful job of translating from the German. Right, so his title, he calls it The Emotions. That's already a mistake. Why is that a mistake? Well, the definite article in Danish comes at the end of the noun. It's called enklitik, right? So if I'm going to say chair, I say stol, all right? But if I want to say the chair, I have to say stolen. And the n part at the end is the word the, definite article, you see? So if you look up here, om sindsbevægelser, it's not the emotions, because that would be bevægelsen. And that's not what he said. So he said, on emotions. And he says explicitly in the text that there are too many of them and they're different from each other, and he's only going to focus on a core category of very basic emotions like immediate responses of fear or anger. Someone intentionally steps on your foot in the tube, and you're going to have an immediate, spontaneous, and unreflective reaction of perhaps fear or anger or some combination of the two, right? And it's not reflective. It's not mediated by reflection, thought, and complicated deliberation. And those are the kinds of things that Lange studies in that 1885 book, and he calls them Sinnsbevægelser. But he says very explicitly, this is not ordinary Danish usage, right? He's making a technical term. And he says we need two categories. We need this category of primary or basic emotions, but we also need to know that not all of our affective responses are like that. So we get the Danish book, we get a bad German translation of it, we get an interesting thing. A Danish philosopher, Høffding, notices similarities between what James had said in the Mind paper and what Lange had said. And he publishes about that in 1887 in German. Now, along comes William James. 1890, chapter 25 is on the emotions, and that's where James launches the standard account by saying, as I read to you, that there was this independent and quasi-simultaneous discovery. James repeats that claim in his 1894 paper in Psychological Review, The Physical Basis of Emotion. Now, few people know much about this one. This is a book only in Danish in aesthetics, The Psychology of Aesthetic Response by Lange in 1899. There's a very tendentious partial translation of this in German done by this same character, Kurella, and I don't recommend that you try to find out anything about Lange's book here by reading that German translation. And here you have 1922, the English translation that I mentioned. So that's the pensum or required reading list for this topic. Now, more recently, just to give you the flavor of the thing, a very good contemporary American philosopher, Jesse Prinz, has a nice book called Gut Reactions. Prinz is totally on board for this standard account. There's the James-Lange theory of emotion. And what's more, Prinz thinks that this is a very promising theory, and he sees himself as promoting and developing and defending this theory. So here's what Prinz says, at the end, quote, at the end of the 19th century, William James, 1884, and Carl with a K, Sick, Lange, 1885, independently arrived at the conclusion that common sense gets things backward sick. There you have it. So this is a nice picture of boxology provided by Jesse Prinz. This is the theory that James and Lange supposedly independently came up with. So you have some emotionally significant object which is perceived by the subject, and perception here is to be taken quite literally, the five senses, right? There's then a spontaneous automatic change in bodily state, such as contraction, muscular contraction, visceral changes of various kinds. And then there's a subjective registering in consciousness and feeling of that peripheral bodily event. That's sometimes called the peripheric theory of emotion, because it's not just happening in the brain. There's this automatic response in the body, and that's what you're feeling. Okay? So the way to describe and explain emotions is to describe and explain those bodily events that are the proximate cause of the feeling. Huh? Okay. And Prinz calls it the somatic, soma is the body, right? The somatic feeling theory. Right, let me move on. This is a long quote from James. Maybe I should move on because I'm afraid I'm taking too long, where you get him in a very rhetorical way stating this this account of emotion. I'll skip that. Now we come to the problems. All right. I'm trying to say that the standard account, which you will find on the internet, if you Google for 5 minutes, you will find loads and loads of evidence telling you that the standard account is correct. And this Livingston guy must be just ill-informed, right? But I'm going to try to show that, in fact, these two thinkers, Lange and James, didn't defend the same theory. All right. What's more, they had highly divergent explanatory models, even with regard to these primary or core emotions like spontaneous fear, disgust, and anger. And they had, thirdly, divergent claims regarding the relation of their results to historical antecedents. Very pointedly, James tells you that this is an original, striking, innovative new theory that he and Lange independently discovered. Lange, on the other hand, is very modest and says, this has been known for a long, long time, and there's nothing really new or original about it. This is kind of stating the obvious, I hope. But you know, if you're going to claim that two theorists diverge theoretically, you might want to say, well, what does that mean? You know, what are your assumptions about theory and so on? And I simply lay out here what I take it as a fairly uncontroversial yardstick here. You know, under what conditions do two people not have the same theory? Well, if there are certain propositions or beliefs that are really important for the theory, and if the one thinker asserts that proposition, whereas the other thinker denies it or is indifferent to it, then we don't want to say they had the same theory, right? So, I mean, if one of you wants to challenge me, we can talk about whether these assumptions are defensible or not, but I kind of think they're truisms, right? And so I just want to say I'm not challenging the standard account by saying that, you know, James and Lange diverge in some really tricky, weird kind of way. You know, what I'm saying is their theorizing is very obviously divergent in ways that we all should recognize and should agree about. All right? And it's not a matter of a tricky interpretation. I'm not going to try to say there's some obvious way to read what they said, what they wrote, but in fact it's wrong. You know, I'm going to say there's an obvious way to read what they wrote. If you actually read what they wrote, you see that they diverge. All right. So here's Lange, my translation. Quote, "It is important to have as pure a concept as possible, by which I mean a concept that only covers items that are homogeneous from a psychological point of view. Sorrow, joy, fear, anger, and similar items form one group, whereas love, hatred, contempt, admiration, and similar items belong to another group, which, psychologically speaking, should be kept separate. We should not throw things such as terror, rage, and joy in with envy, love, the feeling of freedom, and so on." 1885, pages 4 to 5. So this is very obviously a thinker who's telling you that you need, within the broad category of psychological affect, to draw a distinction between two different groups. He doesn't care what words you use to label those groups. He recruits the Danish term sindsbevægelse for the first group, and he recruits the word passion for the other group, but he says, call it what you like. All right? It's not the labels that are really important. Now, this could take a little bit too long. One way to do this thing is you ask yourself the following question. This is a long time ago. Obviously, the philosophy and psychology of affect has moved on since the latter part of the 19th century. So, like, you could ask, what have people found lacking or incorrect in James's theorizing in psychology? And that started really early. Edmund Gurney, quite a brilliant figure who wrote about the psychology of music, right, published a critique of James's view of emotion in mind and said the following very insightful thing. As soon as we advance to cases where the close and assignable relation to the environment ceases, the difficulties of the theory begin. What does he mean by that? Well, if you talk about disgust, and there's certain, you come along and you smell or see something disgusting, you have an immediate response of disgust. All right, and so that kind of immediate stimulus response mechanism is like easy enough to plot, right? And if that's your basic model of emotion, you're going to get into trouble when you get to something a little more complex, right? And here's how Damasio, who also critiques James, spells this out. And I think this is a lovely passage, so I'll read it to you. Here's what Damasio says in his very nice book, Descartes' Error from 1994. His account works well for the first emotions one experiences in life, but it does not do justice to what Othello goes through in his mind before he develops jealousy and anger, or to what Hamlet broods about before exciting his body into what he will perceive as disgust, or to the twisted reasons why Lady Macbeth should experience ecstasy as she leads her husband into a murderous rampage. So you see, this Damasio is saying a little bit the same thing as what Lange said. Sure, we have these basic early emotions coming from a certain part of the brain, that kind of part of the brain that developed earlier than Homo sapiens, right? Such as immediate reactions of fright, disgust, and anger. But then you have the more cerebral emotions or passions, which we learn about by reading Shakespeare. So my contention is that those critiques of James are sound, but they're not applicable to Lange, precisely because Lange insisted on drawing crucial distinctions within the broader category of affective psychological states. So James's lists are quite different from Lange's. Look at James's list here. Rapture, love, ambition, indignation, and pride, considered as feelings, are fruits of the same soil with the grossest bodily sensations of pleasure and of pain. What did Lange say? You shall not throw love into the same bin along with disgust and anger and spontaneous fright. You need two different categories. Here's James burking that very distinction that Lange insisted on drawing. I should move on. James had views about classification that Lange did not share. I won't linger over that, and so on. Now, I come to an objection. It's always a good idea to try to think of strong objections to your own pet theory, right? Because other clever people will come along and think of those objections and hit you with them. So you have to do your own damage to yourself as best you can in order to avoid trouble in public. So here's an objection to what I'm saying. All right? Come on. We're going to set aside Lange's emotion, passion, distinction. We're going to set that distinction aside, and we're going to say this. Look, didn't James's and Lange's theories converge, at least with regard to how primary emotions, such as fear and anger, should be explained? And if so, the standard account isn't so very misleading after all. And you go back to Google and find good, solid testimony there, right? So all you're saying, Livingston, is that Lange wanted to talk about emotions versus passions, and James wanted to talk about emotions in general, but weren't they saying the same thing about those core emotional episodes, in which case the standard account is worth talking about? Well, this is where the talk gets a little bit difficult, perhaps tedious. Let me plunge into this. The way to test that objection is to say, well, all right, let's look at the explanatory models on offer here, and let's see, focus on something like anger or disgust, and let's see if Lange and James actually tried to explain them in the same way. Were their explanatory models convergent, at least with regard to this restricted category of psychological items? Yeah? So we go into what James really says. So you have stages in James's explanation of emotions. How does it work? Well, either, first case, a sensory organ is activated by some object and is then apperceived by some cortical center. Apperception is a kind of psychological happening that James doesn't tell us much about. He just assumes you can figure out what that means. I mean, to apperceive is usually some kind of mode of conscious introspection, right? So he's just giving himself the movement into consciousness here, all right? Or some cortical center is activated in some other way that gives rise to an idea of a sensorial activation by an object, all right? Then what happens? So that's step one, and you have two different pathways, all right? Step two, something called reflex currents pass from the brain down into the body where they cause changes in the viscous, muscles, and skin. Reflex currents. 3, these changes are apperceived by the cortical centers. 4, the latter apperception combines with the initial apperception of the object in 1 or with the apperceived image of an object via 2. So you get these two different apperceptive events which combine. A higher order apperception of the two apperceptions, perhaps. And finally, 5, these combined apperceptions cause the sensed objects to be experienced as the object of a feeling or emotion. Wow. All right, I'm not going to try to defend that. I'm not even sure it's like fully intelligible. Sorry, I should have clicked along the way. But there you have it laid out. This is the sort of basic model according to William James. Now, what about Lange? Does he say the same thing? Here's Lange's explanatory model for primary emotions: disgust, anger, fear. In the simplest case, an impression received by a sensory organ passes to a cerebral sensory center and then along the nerves to the vasomotor center, which affects changes in vascular innervation. What's that? Swelling or contraction of the blood vessels, right? These changes are felt as bodily events, and those feelings are the emotions. But in some passages, Lange says the emotion is the whole process as opposed to just the feeling. So there we have a tricky business there, because James insists that the emotion is just the feeling. You have this bodily event and then you have a feeling. You feel your body. And the emotion is just that feeling part. Sometimes Lange says that, but other times he says the emotion is the whole episode, starting with the stimulus, the corporeal response to the stimulus, and then whatever sort of conscious states might follow from that. So there's a difference with the very identification of the emotional event in some of the passages. Now, so Lange also says the following. He says, in complex cases, there is a conditioned emotive response. An associative link between cortical centers makes possible an indirect stimulation of the vasomotor center, causing felt peripheral innervations. So, for example, and here you can all get this because it's we're very familiar with this way of thinking. Lange says, and this is 1885, the unpleasant taste of medicine has become associated with the sight of the spoon in the mind of a child. Seeing the spoon activates the gustatory cortical center through an associative pathway. The vasomotor center then causes innervations experienced as fear. And here you have an early anticipation of Pavlovian conditioning theory, because the sight of the spoon becomes something fearful in the mind of the child, because the child has learnt through experience that every time the mother gets out that particular spoon and heads his way, that old nasty medicine is coming, okay? So this is an interesting, Lange, I think, was really onto something new here, because Lange is before Pavlov, right? But you don't find this anticipation of conditioning theory in James. Right? So that's an important difference between the two explanatory models. And James, you know, has said that he and Lange independently discovered the same theory of emotions. All right? But look what James says in a private correspondence to his friend, the very influential French psychologist Ribot. This is in a letter of July 1888. 2 years before he published Principles of Psychology, where he says he and Lange are good mates who published the same theory. What does James say to Ribot? I confess he seems to me to exaggerate the primary character of the vasomotor manifestations. I see no reason why we should not assume coordinate effects on the vasomotor and the voluntary muscular systems. In other words, James writes to his friend and says he disagrees with a key component of Lange's theory, because Lange insisted on the idea that anytime you have a basic emotive response, it's the vasomotor system which is causally effective. All right, so let me sum up. The proposed explanatory models diverge. James thought his theory explained all affect. Lange restricted his remarks to a narrower category, one that corresponds to what Damasio calls the primary or earlier emotions. James denied the existence of the specialized affective activation centers. There was no modularity. He disagreed with Lange's postulation of the vasomotor system center as a single brain structure active in all primary emotional episodes. So that, I'm sorry, I hope you will now be persuaded that that is a significant theoretical divergence, even with regard to the restricted category of primary or basic emotional responses such as spontaneous fear, disgust, and anger. Okay? Now, how do you explain the persistence of an erroneous, a factually incorrect standard account? Well, first of all, blame Wikipedia, because people just go and they look things up on Wikipedia, and as you know, that's a crowd blathering at you, and so people just repeat what they found in some old psychology textbook, and the people who wrote the psychology textbook didn't read Danish, and so they were stuck with an inadequate corpus on which to base their account. Mimetism, you know, imitation, just repeating what other people have said. Second reason is that James, as the professor of scientific psychology at Harvard University, had a lot of authority, carried a lot of weight, and he tells you that he and Lange had the same theory, right? And people bought that. Lange never came out and said, no, I don't agree with William James. He was too busy doing other things, and I think at some deep level he was contemptuous of this kind of rampant philosophizing that James was doing and couldn't be bothered to speak out and disagree. I cannot prove it, but there's lots of evidence supporting the conjecture that Lange certainly knew about what James had said. He knew that James had been recruiting him for this account of emotion, but he wasn't really impressed by that. Wasn't really on board for it, but did not wish publicly to contest it. Why else does this standard account persist in spite of its factual inaccuracy? Lack of reliable translations. I've described that already a bit. Don't have time to go into the details. They're fairly gory, right? And then, okay, let's admit it, there is some actual overlap between Lange and James on, some points. So let me spell that out. Here's how they agree, okay? James says, quote, a purely disembodied human emotion is a non-entity. And Lange says, quote, the emotions are not forces that stand outside the body and dominate it. Okay? That's very striking convergence. Isn't that what the standard account says? Yes, fine. But this is not an original or positive account of the emotions worthy of the name the James-Lange theory. And why not? Because plenty of people had said that long before James and Lange, right? Thomas Hobbes is a materialist, and he writes about emotions as bodily events. That's significantly before 1885. Okay, and in the case of Lange, you have an admission of this. So I call this contrasting second-order claims. James, a theory, blah, 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 which I had already broached the previous year in an article in Mind. So here you have James broaching a theory, right? Lange, quite differently, writes as follows. Oddly enough, someone actually managed to set forth a vasomotor theory of the emotions' bodily manifestations almost 200 years ago. This was Malebranche, who completely lacked the relevant physiological background knowledge, since at the time nothing was known of the vascular muscles and nerves. Yet his genial eye spotted the right connection in this regard. So here's Lange saying it wasn't a new claim. 200 years earlier, Malebranche hit upon this idea, right? Okay. Lange also mentions Spinoza and an obscure Italian author, Boccalossi, as possible antecedents to a physiological account of the emotions, right? How am I doing on time, James? Should I hold forth a little bit longer? Okay, I promised to talk a little bit about Lange's aesthetics. I can do so fairly quickly. What is the point of that in terms of my more general argument? Well, the point of that is that Lange, he wrote this short book on emotion in 1885, and then late in his life he was struggling with illness. He wanted to write in aesthetics, and so it was almost complete, and it was published in 1899, but only in Danish. And so James couldn't have known about it. But the point here is that he says, he explicitly refers back to his distinction between two categories of psychological affective events, emotion versus passion. And he admits freely that when we come to aesthetics, most of what we need are these more complex, secondary, mediated psychological responses. Most of the time when we're responding to the beauty of nature or other aspects of nature, or when we're responding to works of art, we are not having these kind of automatic responses of disgust and fear. Yes, there are filmmakers who hit you with a startle response or a response of automatic disgust or something like that, right? But the more interesting aesthetic responses are mediated by reflections and beliefs and complex background knowledge. And so if you're going to do, even if you're going to attempt a physiological aesthetics or a psychological aesthetics, which is what Lange wanted to do, you will need to be talking mostly about the passions and not about the primary emotions. So that's the upshot of the later book by Lange. Had James read it, which he couldn't do because it was only in Danish, he would have realized that he and Lange were not in convergence with regard to the psychology of affect. All right? Now, so let me go into that just a little bit. I say a few things here. I should probably just move on, but James wrote no aesthetics because I think it's a bit speculative to say, but I think the problem there was he had wedded himself to a very mechanistic and restrictive account of emotions, right? And that wouldn't work as a basis for aesthetics. So he ended up as a kind of skeptic about aesthetic theory. And that was not the problem that Lange had, so Lange could develop some more speculations about. Okay, so what we get in Lange is roughly this. This is his 1899 book on the sources of aesthetic pleasure. And Lange identifies three main sources of pleasure in our response to works of art and other aesthetic objects. He doesn't say it's an exhaustive list. He says that's an open question. He thinks that these three kinds of emotive, passionate responses are really important, and he talks about them, all right? So he calls it afveksling in Danish, which translates variously as variety, variation, and change. If you have a simple continuous input, you're going to get bored very quickly. One of the points of art is to relieve our boredom. Games too, right? And how are you going to relieve people's boredom? You have to introduce a variegated, changing stimulus, right? And he goes on and on about different kinds of variety, different kinds of change that can keep an input or a stimulus from being boring. Now, unfortunately, Lange, in this book on aesthetics, doesn't cite a lot of historical antecedents. He should have talked about l'Abbé Dubos, who in the 18th century really emphasized this point about boredom, right? One of the functions of the arts is to relieve the horrific specter of boredom. And I suspect, because Lange was good at Romance languages, fluent in Italian and knew French, I suspect Lange may have read l'Abbé Dubos from the 18th century, because I hear a lot of echoes of Dubos in Lange. The other main source for aesthetic response was what he called sympathie, kind of emotive contagion, so that the work of art represents characters having emotions, and we have a kind of contagious thing, and that could be a matter of feeling sorrow for those who suffer in a work, but also schadenfreude. So Lange thought that some works, the whole point is for us to enjoy, if we're that kind of personality, to enjoy spectacles of suffering. And then his other key source of aesthetic response was Bewunderung, admiration or wonderment, respect. And some of this is a matter of the pleasure we experience when we see something done really well. When we perceive that the artist has overcome great difficulties in doing whatever he or she did, we get pleasure because we admire that. And we enjoy admiring great achievements that we perceive or understand to be very, very skillful. That is, after all, artistry, right? And these are all, of course, just to put the dots on the i's here, secondary emotions or passions. And why? Because it involves memories, reflections, associations of ideas, complex background knowledge. Lange gives examples. I'll be very brief here. I should stop soon so we can have a discussion. So he says, for example, I can admire a work made of glass or metal as long as I take it to be the result of some difficult and artful handicraft, such as forging, cutting, polishing, and other similar activities. Yet my enjoyment, and with it my delight, vanish instantly if I learn that the object was produced effortlessly. For example, through a simple casting, even though its condition and appearance are the same in both cases. So it's kind of an indiscernibility argument because you have two objects which look the same, right? You could even, up the ante and idealize the example, say they're perceptually indistinguishable. So if I go like this, you can't tell which one it was, right? But one will have an aesthetic value that the other will not have if you have background knowledge telling you that the one was difficult to make and made by hand, where the other one was just banged out by some machine. So this is, if you're interested in the history of aesthetics, this is very interesting because it anticipates a whole long series of indiscernibility arguments that become quite influential in 20th century aesthetics. He does it again when it comes to copy and original. He writes as follows. This is the 1899 book in Danish. Suppose a picture and a copy of it, quote, resemble each other like two drops of water. If you know French, you hear an echo of a French expression there, comme deux gouttes d'eau, right? The pleasure they occasion is the same until it is discovered which one is the original. There is then something in a work, this is a quote, there is then something in a work independent of its properties and condition, and there I think he means intrinsic properties, right? Independent of the intrinsic perceptible properties of the work, and we're back to these indiscernibles, right? That can make pleasure possible. As soon as we are aware of differences in their origins, the works have divergent capacities to give rise to a pleasurable response. So there he's saying that the basis of a proper aesthetic response to these two different works is not just an immediate perceptual, spontaneous kind of emotive event. It involves complex mediation through background knowledge of what happened. How was this thing made? Who made it? What was the historical context and so on? Right? So you have here an early anticipation of a contextualism in aesthetics. Well, I think I should probably stop soon here. Okay, one last thing. This is a strange business. I'll conclude with this quotation from Lange himself. As I told you earlier, he maintained silence about his relationship to the work of William James. Okay? But he did, late in life, make this, very late in life, a year before he died, made this one statement. Because he'd been critiqued by this Danish figure, Dr. Lehmann. And so he wrote in an obscure place, Hospitalstine, sort of like a little new internal publication in a Danish hospital, right? So, and he wrote a review of what this Dr. Lehmann had said. And he wrote as follows: in reality, I have not, as is generally said, and as has also been said by Dr. Lehmann, advanced a theory of emotions. I have not advanced a theory of emotions. I have only given the concept a scientific definition in the place of metaphysical ones that merely play with words. The emotions, bodily phenomena, have of course been very well known since olden times. My service in the matter consists of showing that the genesis of these phenomena can be understood without the assumption of a spiritual force or mental entity as their immediate cause, and that what we call emotions are only the sensation of changes in our bodily condition. So this is tricky business here, right? But I kind of, reading between the lines, I think that it's, my conjecture is at least, that when he says, I have not, as is generally said, we should kind of insert there, by William James and others, you know. William James and others have said that I defend his theory of emotion, but in fact I don't have a theory of emotion, and it's not original because we've known since olden times that emotions have physiological, you know, manifestations, and all I've tried to do is to reject mentalism or the dualist kind of theorizing where it's the soul interacting with the body. I mean, you know, he's a materialist, right? So that's the last word, I think, should be from Carl Lange. All right, so listen, thank you for listening. I hope we can have a conversation about this.
Yes.